Good and evil do not exist out there in the world. They live in us, quietly, patiently, like twin serpents coiled around the roots of the soul. Every act of compassion, every cruelty, every moment of courage or cowardice begins in the same soil, the human heart. And that heart, for all its beauty, is not pure. It never was. We are not born saints or monsters. We are born whole, containing both heaven and hell, light and shadow, creation and destruction, locked in an eternal dance. You can feel it, can't you? That quiet struggle inside you. The voice that says, be kind, and the other that whispers, take what's yours. The urge to forgive and the thirst to punish. The longing to rise and the temptation to fall. It's not imagination, it's evolution's oldest inheritance. The myth of good and evil is the oldest story humanity has ever told. Older than scripture, older than civilization. It began when we first looked at our own reflection and realized that the same hands that could build could also kill. We didn't understand this duality, so we gave it names. Angels and demons, gods and devils, light and darkness. But these were never external forces, they were metaphors for the split inside us. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge, repress, or deny. The anger we bury, the envy we mask with smiles, the lust we moralize away. And yet, the shadow never dies. It waits. It watches. It grows in silence until the day it demands to be seen. That's why the world is filled with people who preach goodness but act with cruelty, because the shadow, when denied, becomes possession. The man who says he hates evil often hates the reflection of his own darkness in others. Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That is the real work, not escaping evil but understanding it. Because only by facing what is monstrous in us can we truly be good. But that truth is unbearable to most. It's easier to divide the world into heroes and villains, saints and sinners, us and them. It gives us the illusion of purity. But purity is a lie, and a dangerous one. The bloodiest chapters in human history were written by those who believed they were doing good. Every crusade, every genocide, every ideology of salvation began with a dream of moral perfection. That's the paradox. The more certain someone is of their goodness, the closer they drift toward evil. The philosopher Hannah Arendt saw this when she studied the psychology of those who committed atrocities. They weren't monsters. They were ordinary men, bureaucrats, fathers, people who convinced themselves they were serving a higher cause. Evil, she realized, is not always born of hatred. Sometimes it's born of obedience, of the desire to belong. And that's the most terrifying part. Evil doesn't feel evil from the inside. It feels righteous. It feels necessary. It wears the mask of virtue. So where does this leave us? Inside each of us, that battle rages. It's not a metaphor, it's neurological. The brain itself is divided between impulse and restraint, passion and reason. The limbic system screams for immediate gratification. The prefrontal cortex whispers, wait. And every decision we make is a negotiation between those two voices. We call it morality, but it's really just consciousness learning to govern its own chaos. Yet the struggle is not meant to be won. It's meant to be witnessed. Because the moment you try to defeat your darkness, you become enslaved by it. The key is integration, not destruction. Nietzsche warned about this in one of his most haunting lines. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that he does not become a monster. For when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. We love to gaze into that abyss, into villains on screens, corruption in politics, chaos in the world, but rarely do we see how it mirrors us. Every outrage, every act we condemn, contains a seed that could grow in our own hearts under the right conditions. That's not pessimism. That's honesty. Because the truth is, the capacity for evil is what makes goodness meaningful. If we were incapable of cruelty, then kindness would mean nothing. If we could not destroy, then creation would not be sacred. The gods of myth understood this. Shiva, the destroyer, was also the preserver. The serpent in Eden was not just temptation, it was awakening. Every act of rebellion, every moral fall, was also a step toward consciousness. Think of it this way. The first humans ate from the tree of knowledge not because they were wicked, but because they were curious. They wanted to know. And in that act, in that defiance, they became aware. That awareness was both the birth of evil and the dawn of freedom. We've been living in that paradox ever since. The story of humanity is not a war between good and evil, but a conversation between them. Each needs the other to exist. Light defines itself against darkness. Order emerges only after chaos. Even your own identity is forged through that contrast, through the tension between who you want to be and who you fear you are. And yet, modern culture tries to erase that complexity. We worship the image of moral perfection, influencers, saints, heroes, and demonize the flawed, the conflicted, the raw. But what we reject externally only grows internally. That's why our collective shadow keeps returning, in violence, addiction, manipulation, obsession. The parts of us we exile don't vanish. They revolt. The ancient Gnostics understood this better than most religions that followed. They believed the true battle between good and evil was not fought in heaven, but inside the human soul. The serpent was not evil, it was the catalyst for knowledge. Evil was ignorance, the refusal to see reality as it is. So what does that mean for you, right now listening to this? It means the war you feel inside, the guilt, the conflict, the contradiction, is not proof of your failure. It's proof of your humanity. The person who never wrestles with their own darkness isn't pure, they're asleep. To be awake is to know both your light and your shadow, to hold them in balance without letting either consume you. That's the beginning of real power. And if you followed me this far, maybe you felt it, that quiet recognition that you too contain multitudes, that your kindness is born from struggle, your compassion from pain, your strength from surviving your own darkness. That's not weakness, that's transcendence. We are not angels pretending to be human. We are humans learning how to carry both heaven and hell without losing ourselves. This is why myth still matters, because it reminds us that the gods and demons we worship are not forces to obey, but reflections to integrate. Hercules fighting the Hydra, Christ resisting temptation, the Buddha confronting Mara. These are not external stories. They are psychological blueprints. They show us what it means to face the chaos within and emerge conscious. So the question isn't, how do I destroy my darkness? But how do I learn from it? Because darkness, when understood, becomes wisdom. Pain, when accepted, becomes compassion. And maybe that's the hidden truth we've always missed. That good and evil are not enemies, but partners in the evolution of consciousness. Stay with me, because this battle doesn't end in the heart. It moves outward, into society, into power, into the collective illusions that shape what we call morality. In the next part, we'll go deeper into how cultures, religions, and systems have used this inner duality to control and define us, and how reclaiming that awareness might be the only true act of freedom left. If this resonates with you, if it stirs something familiar yet forbidden, that quiet recognition of your own shadow, then stay close. Subscribe not to escape the darkness, but to walk through it consciously. Because the real journey doesn't lead to heaven or hell. It leads inward. Every society builds itself upon a moral story. It begins as myth, becomes doctrine, and eventually turns into law. And beneath every law lies a single question: what is good? But who decides that? From the dawn of civilization, morality has never been neutral. It has always served power. The tribe's survival depended on unity, and unity demanded belief. So the storytellers, the priests, the kings, the philosophers became architects of the soul. They built invisible structures inside the human mind, shaping how we perceive right and wrong, sin and virtue, purity and corruption. Morality, in this sense, is the most elegant form of control ever invented. It doesn't chain the body, it colonizes the conscience. It makes you police yourself. You can see it in the ancient codes, the 10 Commandments, Hammurabi's laws, the edicts of emperors. They all begin with divine authority, not human reasoning. Because if you can convince people that your rules come from God, they'll obey without question. The fear of punishment in this life may not be enough, but eternal damnation? That's obedience carved into eternity. But here's the deeper, darker truth. The creation of morality was never about eradicating evil. It was about managing it, channeling it, giving it a direction that served the system. The aggression that once led to chaos was repurposed for war. The desire for dominance was baptized as leadership. The hunger for wealth became a divine calling. Evil wasn't destroyed, it was domesticated. That's how civilizations thrive, by sanctifying their own vices and condemning everyone else's. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche saw through this illusion with terrifying clarity. He argued that morality itself was born from resentment, the bitterness of the weak toward the strong. He called it slave morality, the inversion of natural values. Strength, once admired, became sin. Weakness, once pitted, became virtue. The wolf was condemned for being a wolf by the sheep who could not defend themselves. It's a brutal view, but not without insight. Because when you strip away the divine language, What remains is strategy, morality as a survival mechanism. Every should and must hides a power dynamic. Every virtue serves someone's interest. Think of how the powerful have always cloaked themselves in moral rhetoric. Empires invade to bring civilization. Religions convert to save souls. Governments censor to protect truth. Even today, corporations talk about values while exploiting the very people they claim to empower. The language of goodness is the most efficient disguise for domination. But that doesn't mean morality itself is meaningless. It means we have to see it for what it is, a living negotiation between our higher and lower natures, between freedom and order, compassion and control. The problem arises when we mistake morality for truth, when we forget that it's a story, not a law of nature. That's when morality becomes moralism, rigid, self-righteous, blind. And moralism, history shows, has a strange tendency to produce the very evil it claims to fight. The Inquisition burned people alive to defend love. The guillotine fell in the name of liberty. Censorship thrives in the name of protection. Every utopia begins with a promise of goodness and ends in terror. Why? Because when a society believes it has found absolute good, it gives itself permission to do absolute evil. Hannah Arendt called this the banality of evil. She saw it not in madmen, but in ordinary people, clerks, officers, citizens, who committed atrocities without hatred, simply because they believed they were doing the right thing. Evil, she realized, doesn't always wear horns. Sometimes it wears a uniform, a slogan, a smile. And you can see it still. Every online mob convinced of its righteousness, every political faction that demonizes the other side, every individual who mistakes moral outrage for virtue. We live in an age where morality has become theater, performance instead of practice. The louder someone declares their goodness, the more you should wonder what darkness they're trying to drown out. Because true morality doesn't need an audience. It's quiet. It's internal. It wrestles in silence. But modern society fears silence. It thrives on spectacle, the endless battle of good versus evil played out on screens and feeds, each side convinced of its sanctity. The irony is that both are driven by the same shadow, the desire to be right, to be pure, to belong. We have replaced introspection with ideology. Instead of confronting our own inner evil, we outsource it to others, to them, the villains, the corrupt, the misguided. In doing so, we become exactly what we condemn. It's psychological displacement on a massive scale. Jung called it projection. When we refuse to acknowledge our shadow, we cast it onto the world. The result is perpetual conflict, because what we hate in others is often what we cannot face in ourselves. That's why history keeps repeating its darkest chapters, because the moral war outside mirrors the unresolved war within. But imagine, just for a moment, what would happen if that pattern broke? If humanity stopped projecting its shadow outward and began integrating it consciously. If instead of dividing the world into saints and sinners, we saw that every human being, including ourselves, carries both. That shift alone could change everything. Because once you stop seeing evil as out there, you can begin transforming it in here. And that is the beginning of freedom. The ancient alchemists understood this symbolically. They called it the nigredo, the black stage of transformation, the confrontation with darkness. To reach gold, one had to first descend into the shadow. They weren't talking about metal. They were talking about the soul. Maybe morality needs the same alchemy, not purity but integration. Not denial but awareness. Because if good and evil are both parts of the same human spectrum, then true ethics isn't about eliminating one side. It's about balance, understanding the forces within us well enough to guide them, rather than be consumed by them. But such awareness is dangerous, because it dismantles control. A society built on rigid morality cannot tolerate individuals who see through its illusions. That's why prophets, mystics, and visionaries throughout history were often persecuted. They were too free to be ruled by fear. Socrates was executed for corrupting the youth. In truth, for teaching them to think. Jesus was crucified for challenging the moral order of his time. Spinoza was excommunicated for questioning the authority of Scripture. Every time someone awakens to the relativity of morality, power trembles. And yet, those are the figures who move humanity forward, not by preaching goodness, but by revealing its complexity. They remind us that real virtue doesn't come from obedience, but from consciousness. So perhaps the question we should be asking isn't what is good, but who benefits from my belief in this version of good. Every time you feel certain, pause. Certainty is the enemy of wisdom. The moment you're convinced you're on the side of light, look for the shadow that certainty casts. because it's there waiting. The true moral act is not to choose sides, but to remain awake, to act from awareness, not ideology. And yet, that awareness demands something few are willing to offer: the death of innocence. To see that good and evil are not cosmic opposites but human capacities, and that both live in you, is to lose the comfort of moral simplicity forever. But it is also to gain something greater, the possibility of conscious choice. That is where freedom begins, not in the purity of the good, but in the understanding of the whole. If you're still here, still listening, then you've already stepped into that awareness, into the moral gray where truth actually lives. So stay close, because in the next part, we go beyond the structures, into the intimate, personal confrontation with the shadow. The final part is not about society, but about you, about how to face the war inside without losing your humanity, and how that battle, if fought consciously, becomes the seed of transcendence itself. And if this journey has been unsettling, that's good. Growth always is. Subscribe not for comfort, but for clarity, because the light that truly transforms is never gentle. It burns, it reveals, it heals. There comes a moment, often in silence, when the battle between good and evil stops being theory and becomes experience. It's not something that happens in books or on screens. It happens in the quiet hours, when you lie awake, haunted by what you've done, what you've wanted, what you've denied. When you realize that the line dividing good and evil does not run between nations or faiths or ideologies. It runs through every human heart. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who survived the Soviet gulags, said those words, and he meant them literally. He saw both compassion and cruelty emerge from the same men, sometimes within the same hour. He learned that the potential for darkness isn't confined to monsters. It's the inheritance of being human. That realization can shatter you, because once you see it, you can no longer maintain the illusion of innocence. You can't pretend evil is something out there. You see that every act of betrayal, every moment of selfishness, every cruelty you've condemned, could have been you, under different circumstances. It's a brutal mirror, but it's also sacred, because what you're really seeing in that moment is not depravity, it's potential. The same energy that fuels destruction can also create art, compassion, courage. The same fire that burns can illuminate. What matters is consciousness, whether you wield it or it wields you. That's the essence of the human condition, to carry both the murderer and the saint, and to choose, again and again, who you will become. The ancients knew this truth long before psychology gave it words. In every culture's mythology, the hero's journey is never about slaying evil out there. It's about confronting it within. Hercules battles the Hydra not because monsters exist, but because temptation does. The Buddha faces Mara, the embodiment of desire and fear, not to destroy him, but to understand him. Christ's 40 days in the desert are not punishment, but purification. Each story tells the same secret. The only real victory is self-mastery. But we've forgotten how to read those stories. We treat them as moral fables rather than psychological maps. We pray for strength while avoiding the struggle that grants it. We call for peace without facing the violence in ourselves. The truth is that good and evil aren't separate forces at war. They are the two poles of the same energy. Creation and destruction, order and chaos, love and fear. To live consciously is not to eliminate one, but to balance both. Jung called this individuation, the process of integrating the shadow, of becoming whole. He said that the greatest danger to humanity is not the evil we recognize, but the evil we refuse to see. Because the unconscious, when ignored, takes over. That's why denial is so seductive. It gives us temporary peace. But peace built on denial is fragile, a house built over a volcano. It only takes one tremor, a betrayal, a failure, a loss, and all that buried shadow erupts. We become what we've always feared. You've probably felt it, that moment when rage overtakes reason, when jealousy poisons love, when self-loathing turns outward as cruelty. And afterward, the shame comes, the confusion, the question, how could I do that? But the question is wrong. You didn't do it. You are it, or at least a part of you is, a part you have not yet met with compassion. And that's the turning point, because the path to goodness isn't paved with denial, it's paved with understanding. Imagine looking at your shadow not with judgment, but with curiosity. To see your anger as wounded power, your envy as unfulfilled potential, your fear as the guardian of your boundaries. In doing so, you begin to reclaim the energy you've been at war with. That's not moral failure, that's psychological maturity. The saints of history were not flawless. They were integrated. They faced their darkness without being consumed by it. That's what made them luminous. Their light was forged in the fires of their own imperfection. That's why every true spiritual path begins in darkness. The mystics called it the dark night of the soul. It's the collapse of the false self, the identity built on being good, on being right, on being loved. When that identity falls apart, what remains is raw awareness, consciousness stripped bare. And in that void, you face the truth that your goodness was never about purity but about presence. To be good is not to be perfect. It's to be awake. That's the alchemy of the soul. Because once you stop running from your darkness, something extraordinary happens. The same energy that once terrified you becomes your power. Anger becomes clarity. Desire becomes direction. Pain becomes empathy. Evil, when integrated, becomes wisdom. The philosopher Kierkegaard called this the synthesis of despair, the moment when the self accepts its own paradox. It is both finite and infinite, flawed and divine, tragic and beautiful. Only then can it truly act freely. Freedom, after all, isn't doing whatever you want. It's knowing why you want it, and that requires an honesty most people avoid for a lifetime. Because to be honest with yourself is to risk dismantling everything you believe you are. It's to face the raw chaos of your own motives, the parts of you that love control, that crave admiration, that secretly feed on pain. But within that chaos lies the possibility of transformation, not moral, but existential. The battle between good and evil is not a war to win. It's a dance to master. The more aware you become, the more graceful the dance. You stop reacting blindly and start choosing consciously. You stop condemning your impulses and start learning from them. You stop trying to be good and start becoming whole. That's what redemption really means, not divine forgiveness, but psychological integration. To redeem is to reclaim, to bring back what was lost. And when you do, when you stop dividing yourself, something miraculous happens, compassion. Not the sentimental kind, but the fierce kind, the compassion that comes from knowing exactly what darkness feels like, because you've faced it and survived. That compassion changes everything. It radiates outward. You stop seeing enemies and start seeing wounds. You stop judging the world through the lens of right and wrong, and start seeing it through the lens of cause and consequence, fear and longing. That doesn't make evil disappear. It makes it comprehensible, and therefore transformable. That's the highest form of good there is, the ability to transform suffering into understanding, hatred into empathy, destruction into creation. That's what the mystics, the philosophers, the artists have always known. That light doesn't defeat darkness. It includes it. So maybe the point was never to conquer evil, but to outgrow the illusion that good and evil are enemies at all. Think about it. What if heaven and hell were not destinations, but states of consciousness, reflections of whether we've integrated our duality or not? What if the soul's journey isn't about ascending into purity, but descending into wholeness? That would change everything, because then salvation wouldn't be about escaping the world, it would be about awakening within it. And maybe that's what this life is for, to learn how to carry both light and shadow without collapsing, to become a bridge between the two. So, if you've made it here, if something in you feels both shaken and strangely understood, it means the war inside you is already transforming. You're not losing the battle. You're learning to see it. That's where real strength begins, not in purity, but in awareness. Not in victory, but in vision. Because once you understand the darkness within you, it no longer owns you. You can walk through it. You can use it. You can turn it into light. That's the final paradox. The closer you come to your darkness, the more light you become. And maybe that's what every myth, every religion, every moral story was trying to tell us all along. That the divine is not the absence of shadow, but the mastery of it. So when you next feel that pull, the anger, the envy, the hunger, don't recoil. Listen. It's your shadow speaking, asking to be seen. And when you meet its gaze, do not look away. Because in that gaze lies everything you've ever feared, and everything you've ever needed to become whole. The battle is not over, and it never will be. But that's the beauty of it, because the struggle itself is life. The war keeps consciousness awake. So keep watching, keep questioning, keep choosing, not to be perfect, but to be present. And if this journey has reached something deep inside you, a recognition, a tremor, a quiet yes, then stay. Subscribe not to me, but to your own unfolding. Because the greatest story ever told is still being written, right now inside you. And when you finally see both your darkness and your light clearly, you'll understand that they were never at war. They were always in love.